and Executive Director of Energy Communities IWG.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of our webinar series, where we're highlighting how the Inflation Reduction Act benefits energy communities. I'm Brian Anderson, Executive Director of the Energy Communities IWG, and we have an incredible lineup of speakers for you today. But before we dive in, I do want to run through some quick housekeeping items. So first, as a reminder, for those of you who are joining us, this webinar is being recorded and will become available online along with the relevant resources. As a note, all participants are muted except those speaking, but you can submit your questions via the Q&A box. Please do use the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will be able to gather, collate, and answer your questions. If you do have any technical help, then please use the chat function to send a chat to the host. You can access our agenda for today through the link that's in the chat. And again, like I mentioned, we have an incredible lineup of federal speakers who are going to speak to multiple Inflation Reduction Act programs and tax credits. So a little word about the Inflation Reduction Act. A little word about the IWG on the next slide before we jump into the topic of today's webinar. Earlier this month, on April 4th, we celebrated the 2-year anniversary of the release of our initial report to the president with an event at the White House that brought together stakeholders representing the top 25 priority energy communities from across the country. We also released the Revitalizing Energy Communities 2-year report to preview the Biden-Harris administration's path forward to ensuring the nation sustains momentum in building a clean energy future made in America and powered by American workers. That 2-year report outlines transformative activities that the administration has taken since January 2021 that provides a robust outreach and engagement within energy communities and to ensure real investments continued flowing to those communities through strategic agency efforts and the implementation of major legislation signed during the administration's first 2 years. You can access the new 2-year report and the live stream White House event, or the recording of the live stream White House event, at energycommunities.gov. Energycommunities.gov is really your place to go for all of our information presented here today and in the past. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that the U.S. Department of Energy and the Department of Treasury released a new eligibility map for the Energy Community Tax Credit Bonus. It was defined in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. The Energy Community Tax Credit Bonus applies a bonus of up to 10% for production tax credits or 10 percentage points for ITCs or investment tax credits for projects, facilities, and technologies that are located in our energy communities around the country. Increased credit amounts or rates are available to taxpayers that satisfy certain energy community requirements under Sections 45, 48, 45Y, 48E of the Internal Revenue Code. This map does not apply to the 48C program, but the mapping tool reflects currently available data on 2 types of potentially qualifying energy communities. First, the map shows the census tracts around the country and the directly adjoining tracts, all of this defined in the IRA, that have had coal mine closures since 1999 or coal-fired electric generating units retirements since 2009. Second, the map shows the metropolitan statistical areas and the non-metropolitan statistical areas that have had 0.17% or greater direct employment related to the extraction, production, processing, transport, or storage of coal, oil, or natural gas, again, as defined in the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act. If we go to our next mapping tool, the Department of Energy released a new coal power plant redevelopment visualization tool that identifies coal power plants that have been closed or that are set to retire, alongside key infrastructure characteristics that are relevant for potential redevelopment opportunities, like in the Loan Program Office tool. This mapping tool serves as a public database and a map for the purposes of enabling state and local economic development officials or project developers or power plant owners to help identify and pursue opportunities for redevelopment and community reinvestment for these plants. This coal power plant redevelopment visualization tool and the Energy Community Tax Credit Bonus are available again on our website at energycommunities.gov. If we look at some highlights of the IRA on the next slide, the Inflation Reduction Act really is the most significant legislation on clean energy and climate change in our nation's history. It's aimed squarely at building a better America and delivering on the president's vision to make sure that the United States, powered by American workers, remains the global leader in clean energy technology, manufacturing, and innovation. It's investing directly in the workers and families that have made sacrifices as we built the economy and the energy industry as we know today. The IRA establishes tax credits and loan guarantee authorities that I mentioned before that stand to mobilize over $250 billion of private sector manufacturing and energy infrastructure investments in energy communities. There's several IRA tax credits that provide a bonus for energy communities, as you can see from the tools, and the new IRA guidebook features more information on these tax credits and other programs that will soon be available. Again, a link to this guidebook is going to be in our chat here in this Zoom today. You'll hear more about the Inflation Reduction Act's tax incentives for energy communities as part of today's webinar, but I want to make a quick note. Specific tax guidance about specific tax programs or questions about projects themselves is not what we're here to do today. We're here to provide an overview of programs and answer general questions, not to provide individualized tax guidance on projects. But you can access many of these programs and our tax credits, again, online at our clearinghouse. And if you haven't heard it enough yet, at energycommunities.gov or energycommunities.gov/funding. So I've mentioned we have a great lineup of speakers for you today, and I am delighted on the next slide to introduce our featured speaker. Lael Brainard is our director of the National Economic Council, and prior to this role, she was vice chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and also served as undersecretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury from 2010 to 2013 and a counselor to the Secretary of Treasury in 2009. During this time, Lael Brainard was the U.S. representative to the G20 finance deputies and the G7 deputies, and was a member of the Financial Stability Board. She has received the Alexander Hamilton Award for her tremendous service to this country. Lael Brainard, it is absolutely my pleasure to have you here today to speak to this webinar, and I'd love to pass it over to you.
Well, Brian, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone participating in this webinar. I want to just thank all of you for your persistent hard work over many years in lifting up America's coal, oil, natural gas, and power plant communities. The work that is being done by this interagency working group has been a very high priority for the Biden-Harris administration. And as I have taken over as NEC director, I'm very delighted to be assuming one of the co-chair roles for this working group. Energy communities have powered our nation quite literally for decades. But as the economy and energy markets have evolved, these communities, as you all well know, have been too often left behind. That's now changing. Building off the American Rescue Plan and the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act provides a very powerful set of tools to ensure energy communities are at the forefront of the next generation of growth and opportunity here in the U.S. The president always talks about his economic vision, that no worker and no community should be left behind. Too many places have suffered disinvestment and deindustrialization over the years and over decades. And those places have to be at the front of the line to realize the gains of the president's agenda. One of the president's first actions was to sign the executive order that created this Energy Communities Interagency Working Group. And we're very pleased that in the latest very important piece of legislation, it will continue the work of this working group and make very significant investments in energy communities. So I want to just talk about three specific ways that the President's Inflation Reduction Act is leading to a reindustrialization and critical investments that will lead to family-sustaining jobs all over America's heartland. First, the revitalization and empowerment of underserved communities is central to the objective of increasing American competitiveness while also rebuilding our middle class. It's a dual mission, and it's a completely integrated mission. Through strategic public investment, we can make the U.S. the world's leader in critical high-growth industries like clean energy, while also ensuring those investments support well-paid union jobs that benefit residents and build local economies. It's a strategy that focuses on meeting our clean energy goals through creating quality jobs all across America. Secondly, the Inflation Reduction Act is distinct in the direct focus it has on places, particularly the regional and local revitalization of energy communities. That is intentional. For too long, the federal government has given out funding and tax credits and expected those benefits to flow down to the right people and places without actually making sure they do. In designing the programs in the Inflation Reduction Act, together with our colleagues in Congress, we actually are ensuring these programs are investing in communities and workers. So let me just give some examples. The bill invests $4 billion through tax credits to support facilities that manufacture and recycle solar, wind, geothermal, and other clean energy technologies in locations where coal mines and power plants have closed. And that includes bonus credits for projects that create good-paying union jobs. The bill includes monumental clean energy production and investment tax credits that have a 10% bonus tax credit for companies choosing to develop clean energy projects in energy communities. The guidance for that bonus was released by Treasury earlier this month, and that includes maps of qualifying areas at energycommunities.gov. The IRA created the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a first-of-its-kind national-scale program to provide competitive grants to mobilize financing and spur investment for clean energy and climate projects in energy communities, which Jai Wise will speak about in greater detail later. We also have a permanent funding fix for the Black Lung Disability Trust Fund. And finally, the IRA provides over $3 billion in grants that offer hands-on technical assistance to help communities advance environmental justice and support projects like community-led air pollution monitoring, prevention, and mediation, climate resiliency, and reducing indoor pollution. And my final point is that these investments aren't happening in isolation. They are complementing historic investments in the American Rescue Plan and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and CHIPS and Science Act in ways that are mutually reinforcing. For instance, the American Rescue Plan dedicated $300 million to Economic Development Administration funds to coal communities. Through programs like the Build Back Regional Challenge, the EDA awarded over $550 million to help energy communities rebuild from the pandemic and preserve and create thousands of jobs. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law amplifies those awards, directly investing $21 billion in remediating brownfields, cleaning up abandoned mine land, and plugging orphaned oil and gas wells. We're already seeing strong evidence that these bills are crowding in private investment. We are tracking the private sector announcements, and we've already seen more than $7 billion invested in 25 of the hardest hit coal communities from Appalachia to the Mountain West. So we're very excited, but we know that all of the hard work lies ahead in terms of implementing these bills and making sure they have the intended effects on the communities that we are really emphasizing. So let me just thank you again. I look forward very much to working with you. The most important piece of this puzzle is the work that you are doing in communities that we are trying to lift up. And let me turn it back to Brian Anderson to introduce some of my colleagues at the Treasury Department, Department of Energy, and the EPA, who will talk further about these initiatives. So Brian, back to you.
Well, Lael, thank you so much for these remarks. Thank you for your leadership and the National Economic Council's partnership on this. This is a tremendous effort out of the White House and across all of our agencies as represented here today. So again, Lael, thank you so much for your comments. As Lael teed up, next I'm going to introduce our next two speakers. Matt Axe is joining us from the Department of Treasury, where he works as a senior advisor for domestic climate policy in the Treasury's Climate Hub, and also our colleague Kate Gordon, who's a senior advisor to the Secretary of Energy right here at the U.S. Department of Energy. And Matt and Kate, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you, Matt.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Brian, and hello, everyone. It's It's great to be here. My name is Matt Axe, and I'm acting co-director of the U.S. Treasury Climate Hub. In that role, I am working closely with my colleagues at the Treasury Department to help implement the historic investments in the Inflation Reduction Act. And a big thanks to Brian Briggs and the entire IWG team for hosting this event and for all the work that's been done over the past 2 years. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Before I jump in, I need to give a quick disclaimer. This deck provides an overview of IRS Notice 2023-29 and certain Inflation Reduction Act tax provisions for general information purposes only and is not itself tax guidance. Notice 2023-29 describes rules that Treasury and the IRS intend to include in upcoming proposed regulations. Treasury and the IRS will solicit and carefully consider public comments before issuing final rules, and those rules could change in the rulemaking process. In the meantime, taxpayers will be able to rely on the rules in Notice 2023-29 until proposed regulations are issued. Next slide, please. The Inflation Reduction Act makes the largest investment in clean energy in our nation's history, and much of that investment is delivered via tax incentives. The Treasury Department is the federal agency responsible for administering the tax code and is proud to be playing a central role in implementing this historic law. The Act includes a wide range of tax incentives for everything from household items like heat pumps and electric vehicles, all the way up to massive utility-scale clean energy projects. It supports established technologies like wind and solar, as well as emerging technologies like clean hydrogen. And it invests in our full clean energy value chain so that we have robust, resilient sources of supply for the components and materials we will need. The Inflation Reduction Act also includes certain cross-cutting provisions and bonuses that apply to multiple incentives, including the Energy Community Bonus, which I'll focus on today. Next slide, please. Before going into detail on the Energy Community Bonus, I'd like to give a brief overview of Treasury's work, which broadly falls into 3 areas. First, we are quickly developing and issuing tax guidance to provide clarity and certainty around how the law's tax incentives will operate in practice. Thus far, we've released around 20 guidance documents, with much more to come in the months ahead. I won't try to summarize all the guidance we've released, but in the chat, we'll post a link to the IRS page that has everything we've released thus far. Second, we are working with the IRS to put in place modern, streamlined processes for taxpayers to claim the clean energy incentives. The law provided funding to modernize the IRS's systems and operations. That funding will significantly improve the taxpayer experience for the better and will be key to the success of the clean energy incentives. Third, Treasury is conducting stakeholder engagement and outreach to inform our approach and to educate the public about the benefits that are now available. Our team has met with hundreds of stakeholders and reviewed thousands of written comments. And as we've released tax guidance, we've held webinars like this one to help translate complex tax rules into understandable terms. Next slide, please. I'll now focus on the Energy Community Bonus. When President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, he enacted a law that not only tackles climate change and spurs clean energy development, but also promotes broad-based economic opportunity across the country, including in our nation's energy communities. The Energy Community Bonus is one important provision in that regard. The Energy Community Bonus can apply to facilities claiming the production or investment tax credit, and I'll walk through each one. As many of you will be familiar, the production tax credit provides a tax credit for production of electricity from renewable sources. This is typically equal to 2.75 cents per kilowatt hour in 2022 dollars, adjusted for inflation annually, where taxpayers meet prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards. The Energy Community Bonus increases the base credit by 10%. The base credit for 2023 is still to be announced, but hypothetically, a typical tax credit of 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour would be increased to 3.025 cents per kilowatt hour with the bonus. Similarly, the investment tax credit provides a tax credit for investment in renewable energy projects. This is typically equal to 30% of investment for projects meeting prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards. The Energy Community Bonus increases the base credit by 2 percentage points or 10 percentage points if prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards are met. So a typical investment credit of 30% would be increased to 40%, again, assuming prevailing wage and apprenticeship standards are met. Next slide, please. How does one know if a project qualifies for the Energy Community Bonus? The Inflation Reduction Act establishes 3 location-based categories of energy communities. First, the brownfield category. Projects can receive the bonus if they are located at a brownfield site as defined in certain sections of the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980, commonly known as CERCLA. Treasury's guidance provides a safe harbor for taxpayers to substantiate that a site meets the definition of a brownfield site. And I won't get into the details of that safe harbor now, but happy to say more in the Q&A if there's interest in hearing more. Second, the statistical area category. Projects can receive the bonus if they are located in a metropolitan statistical area or non-MSA that A, meets certain thresholds for fossil fuel employment or fossil fuel tax revenue at any time since 2009, and B, has an unemployment rate at or above the national average for the previous year. Treasury and the IRS intend to update annually the listing of the statistical area category as new employment data becomes available, generally in May of each year. For the fossil fuel tax revenue threshold, Treasury and the IRS are inviting further comment on the data sources, revenue categories, and procedures to determine eligibility. The final category is the coal closure category. Projects can receive the bonus if they are located in the census tract A, in which a coal mine has closed after 1999, or B, in which a coal-fired electric generating unit has been retired after 2009, or a census tract directly adjoining one or both of those types of census tracts. Treasury and the IRS drew on data from the Mine Safety and Health Administration and the Energy Information Administration to identify these census tracts. Next slide, please. As Brian said earlier, to assist taxpayers in identifying locations eligible for the Energy Community Bonus, the Treasury Department and I work closely with the Department of Energy to develop a mapping tool, which is now available on the Interagency Working Group's website. Please note that for the statistical area category, the map currently only shows potentially qualifying MSAs and non-MSAs, since data on MSA and non-MSA unemployment rates for 2022 is not yet available. Taxpayers looking to the map to determine qualification under the statistical area category should check back in May for an update. Next slide, please. Another important feature of Treasury's guidance is the beginning of construction safe harbor. In general, for taxpayers claiming the production tax credit, the qualified facility must be located in an energy community, and that would be determined year by year. For taxpayers claiming the investment tax credit, the energy project must be placed in service within an energy community, and that would be determined as of the placed in service date. However, to provide greater clarity and certainty for taxpayers, the guidance establishes a safe harbor. For projects beginning construction on or after January 1, 2023, if the project is in an energy community as of the beginning of construction date, then the location will be considered an energy community for the duration of the credit period or on the placed in service date as relevant given the underlying credit to be claimed. In general, at least 50% of the nameplate capacity, or if the project has no nameplate capacity, the footprint must be physically located in an area that qualifies as an energy community in order to receive the bonus. Next slide, please. We can go to the next one. Before I conclude, I wanted to say a word about another important provision, the Advanced Energy Project Credit. This credit was originally established in the 2009 Recovery Act, but the Inflation Reduction Act expanded it and provided $10 billion in new funding. The Advanced Energy Project Credit aims to strengthen the U.S. industrial competitiveness and energy security. It provides an investment tax credit of up to 30% that can be allocated to projects in 3 areas: clean energy technology manufacturing and recycling, industrial decarbonization, and critical materials processing, refining, and recycling. Importantly, of the $10 billion available, at least $4 billion must go to projects in communities in the aforementioned coal closure category that did not receive prior allocations of this credit. The Advanced Energy Project Credit has long been a partnership between Treasury and DOE, and we're thrilled to be renewing that partnership. The application process will be managed by DOE and will begin this summer. So that's the Energy Community Bonus, and then a bit on the Advanced Energy Project Credit. And I'll now pass it off to Kate from DOE to say more. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. And it has been such a great partnership with you and Treasury on this, developing some of the guidance around this provision. And I'm so glad that both Brian and you showed the map so that I don't need to show it again, but really do recommend everybody, again, go to energycommunity.org for all of this background information. You can go to the next slide. So before jumping in on a little more detail on the 48C tax credit, which Matt teed up, I wanted to just spend a minute talking about this question that we are asked a lot through the IWG, which is, what is an energy community? This is a question that you may think has just been answered by Matt, but there are actually a couple of definitions out there, and I just want to clarify them a little bit. Next slide, please. In our, as Brian said, we just released our 2-year report to the president. This text box is in that report. And I'll just go through a minute about what it says. You know, when we started the Interagency Work Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities, many of you were with us at the time. We identified a set of 25 priority communities based on really the urgency of their current situation with regard to closed and closing plants and mines, particularly in coal. And we targeted those 25 communities for significant outreach and engagement, and they now are the basis of many of our rapid response teams. Those were not defined by legislation. So we've been incredibly happy to see Congress and the president pick up this importance of these communities, and in various pieces of legislation define them slightly differently. So I won't go into all the definitions, but I will say those 25 communities are a baseline. They are generally covered, but maybe not entirely, almost entirely covered by the other definitions. But the other definitions in the infrastructure bill, census tracts and directly adjoining census tracts with closed coal plants and mines are in the infrastructure bill for a small and mid-sized manufacturing grant program at the Department of Energy. So that is a coal community definition in the infrastructure bill. That same definition, with a couple of edits, is included in the Inflation Reduction Act as part of that broader energy community definition that you saw, and it's also used in 48C. So basically, the 25 were defined by our interagency work group, looking at just priority areas for us to immediately start to support with our existing federal programs. And then since then, we've seen just enormous new program dollars dedicated to these communities with slightly different definitions. And you can look at that in the report, which I recommend. In general, it's only 30 some pages. It's not too onerous and has a lot of really good information. Next slide. So going into 48C, Matt teed this up. 48C is a tax credit that was originally established actually in 2009 as part of the American Rescue and Recovery Act. This is for clean energy manufacturing and recycling, and has been expanded by the Inflation Reduction Act, first of all, with additional funds. It ran out almost immediately when it was first put out in 2009. This is an extraordinarily popular tax credit because it allows for a range of activities at these manufacturing plants. As Matt said, the Department of Energy is going to be administering this program in some ways like a grant program. We will be doing applications. We will be reviewing those applications with a number of approaches, including a really significant look at how the applicant is looking at providing community benefits with the project, including to energy communities and disadvantaged communities. And so we will be doing those kind of rounds of applications before they get over to Treasury. Next slide. The eligible project types are many. Again, the Inflation Reduction Act expanded the scope of this program to include industrial decarbonization, which is quite an important piece of the puzzle, and also critical materials projects. I'm flagging those for those communities that are on the call for whom you are an energy community because of the existence of a closed mine, for instance. The critical materials projects are potentially of interest to you. So in 3 categories now, the program supports manufacturing and recycling, critical minerals processing, refining and recycling, and industrial greenhouse gas emissions reduction, a wide range of projects included here. Next slide. The impact of this program is really, really important. This program is squarely in the president's goals of increasing our competitiveness through domestic clean energy supply chain development and increasing the U.S. manufacturing capacity for projects that will enable us to really take advantage of what is happening worldwide, which is a real ramp up in clean energy technologies and projects. So this is really part of our overall, as Lael Brainerd said, our overall competitiveness and economic prosperity agenda. We also, the program is also really intended to reduce those greenhouse gas emissions in our existing industrial manufacturing sector, again, making that sector more competitive as we're looking at ramping up U.S. manufacturing, bringing back those middle-skilled jobs, middle-class jobs, building from the bottom up and the middle out, as the president says. Next slide, please. A really important thing of the 48C tax credits and new in the Inflation Reduction Act is that of the $10 billion in tax credits, at least 40% or $4 billion must go to qualifying projects and communities directly impacted by the closure of a coal mine or coal power plant. You will recognize this definition of coal communities. It's the same one, very close to the same one in the infrastructure bill, small and mid-sized manufacturing program run out of DOE. And it is also part of the broader definition of energy communities of that other map you've seen for the tax adder. But this is a carve out of this specific tax credit for these communities, which is very exciting and can really help jumpstart and build on the existing skills and infrastructure of these communities toward revitalizing manufacturing. Next slide. I want to say a couple of words very quickly about some other Department of Energy programs relevant to the folks on the call. The Inflation Reduction Act also created a new loan program office program. The guidance of this is not yet out. We will absolutely be providing that information when it comes out. But importantly, this is up to $250 billion in new loan authority at our loan program office to invest in energy infrastructure repurposing, retooling, repowering, replacing energy infrastructure toward reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So this essentially is where you look for big projects to take that coal plant that's closed and potentially repurpose it to a new use, to a small modular reactor, to a solar storage facility, to an advanced manufacturing facility. This program is new authority that allows those sites to be repurposed, and super exciting from the energy community perspective. Next slide. IRA also expanded both in cost, and I'll be done in 1 minute, Brian, and definition, the carbon management pieces of the tax credits. That is the 45Q program. And really provided additional credits for both carbon management and direct air capture, particularly on industrial facilities. So really dealing with some of those harder to decarbonize parts of the industrial sector, capturing that carbon and sequestering it. And there's a lot of energy community skill in carbon management that can be used for these programs. And I think last slide. And then finally, there's just a host of other programs at the Department of Energy that are complementary. We've talked about them in other webinars. The first webinar in this series went into these in some detail, so I recommend looking at these two together. But it's a very, very exciting moment to look at, you know, the cross-pollination of all of these programs, either available to energy communities, coal communities, or for energy asset repurposing and retooling. Just an enormous set of opportunities, and we're so excited to work with all of you in bringing them to communities. Then back to you, Brian.
Okay, thank you so much. And as you can see, there are so many different programs in Treasury and Department of Energy and in the EPA. And so, Kate Gordon and Matt Axe, thank you so much for that. Just as a reminder to the folks online, we are trying to get to a period where we're going to have Q&A. The Q&A here in the Zoom, we are gathering your questions. And just like our last webinar on this, you can go to events, past events, and you can find the Q&A that was answered in our first one, and we'll get to as many of your questions today as we can. But now, our next speakers from the Environmental Protection Agency, Matt Tejada is the EPA's Deputy Assistant Administrator for Environmental Justice, and Jahi Wise, also with the EPA, serves as a Senior Advisor to the Administrator and Acting Director for EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And so, Matt and Jahi, such a pleasure to have you here today, and I'll pass it right over to you, Matt.
Thank you so much, Brian. Very glad to be with everyone today. So again, Matthew Tejada, Deputy Assistant Administrator for Environmental Justice here at EPA. Going to go right to it because we're really excited that through both the fiscal year appropriations we received in the past couple of years that had some tremendous increases to them, and also the $3 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act for environment and climate justice grants, we're finally going to be able to stand up a holistic community support system through EPA's EJ program. So we are pulling together those $3 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. There was $2.8 billion for grants, $200 million for technical assistance, and then also from our fiscal year 22 and 23 appropriations. We received $100 million in 22, $108 million in 23. We hope those levels keep up. We've been operating for a long time at EPA on about a $10 to $12 million a year budget. So going up to 100 and then $108 million was a significant increase. The majority of those funds of the baseline appropriations are going to go out as grants and technical assistance to complement the $3 billion. We have a little bit of different statutory authority between our baseline appropriation and the Inflation Reduction Act, particularly the ability to fund directly local governments, states, and tribal governments through our baseline appropriations, whereas for the $3 billion in Inflation Reduction Act funding, those go directly to community-based organizations or partnerships of community-based organizations with local governments, tribes, or academic institutions. So the biggest difference between the pots of money is who can receive it. Our money is all focused, though, on going to community-based, community-driven efforts on the ground. And so what I'm going to describe starting on the next slide is that holistic community support program that we are trying to stand up. And it really is intended to meet communities at their needs. There are some communities out there right now who are ready for like a $20 million implementation grant. They have their local government in partnership with them, or they have their tribe in partnership with them. They have folks at the state level. They have other federal agencies, academic institutions, maybe philanthropies working with them. They are ready to go. So this summer, later this summer, we're actually going to be putting out for the first time ever at EPA an environmental justice implementation grant. We haven't even really named it yet, but it's going to be a big grant where the majority of the IRA funding is going to flow through. About $2 billion of the IRA funding is actually going to go through that big implementation grant. So that's for those communities that are out there, you know, and they are ready to rock and roll. Tens of thousands of communities, however, the vast majority of the communities across the United States that really need not only our assistance through the EJ program at EPA, but the funding from all the other programs, the funding that Jahi is going to tell you about from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the funding that our friends over at DOE were just describing, or whether it's coming from transportation or HUD or USDA. The vast majority of communities across the United States are not ready. They need some support to get ready. They need to build the capacity of their organizations. They need to build the partnerships with their local governments, with their states, with their tribal governments, with their academic partners. They need to put together those plans. They need to develop the projects. So that's where we get into this idea of the multi-part, multi-phased community support program. If you go on to the next slide, where we are starting, and this is what we announced just a couple of weeks ago, it's really kind of the backbone of this effort, are the EJ Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers, or the EJ TICTACs. Those are going to be ground floor, front doors. There's no fee to entry. All you got to do is call. All you got to do is email for communities or other folks like tribal governments, like rural local governments that need basic help, the most basic of basic help, right? How to write a grant, how to navigate grants.gov or sam.gov or get their DUNS number, how to meaningfully engage. If you're a utility or a local government and you want to engage your impacted community, but you don't really know how to start that engagement, right? These TICTACs are going to provide that very basic form of technical assistance free of charge across the United States. It is something that folks have been asking for, whether they're EJ organizations or tribes or local governments. Folks have been asking for this for decades. So we are finally able to stand it up in these EJ TICTACs. We just announced them a couple of weeks ago. There will be 14 regionally based TICTACs across the United States, 3 kind of national coordinators and gap fillers of those TICTACs. And then another really important thing, besides just the basic technical assistance that these TICTACs are going to provide, is they're going to be connectors. These are supposed to be hub and spoke networks, right? So all of these other forms of technical assistance that you're hearing about from DOE, and DOE is actually providing funding for the TICTACs as well. But all these other forms of technical assistance that are coming out of DOE or coming out of transportation, or the other forms of technical assistance at EPA, our environmental finance centers for water infrastructures, our technical assistance for brownfields. The TICTACs are going to be the connectors of those. So when the community comes in and they need that basic capacity, and then they need to start finding actually the forms of assistance to help address their issues, the TICTACs are going to be there to navigate the federal government for them. So we're not placing that burden directly on the communities. The TICTACs will be there and will be trained to understand all the other programs that are available across the federal government and connect the communities to those other forms of assistance. And not just give them a URL or hand them a brochure, but actually take them by hand, right? And make the connection, make the introduction, make sure that the community is in touch with the rest of the programs across the federal government. So these TICTACs are getting stood up right now. Over the next couple of months, they're actually going to start coming into being operable. By the time we get to the fall, they'll be operating across the United States, providing this level of technical assistance. Something else that we have out on the street right now on the next slide is we know that communities across the United States, they need ready access to smaller forms of funding. They need $100,000 just to do some educating, to do some organizing, to do some monitoring, some sampling, right? They need that money, and they need it now. They need it quickly, and they need it in thousands of places across the United States. Or they need that small form of grant assistance to start coming up with the plan, right? Or to start developing those really detailed projects so that they can go out and get the funding for them. So right now, we actually have out for competition our Environmental Justice Thriving Community Grant Makers, where we're going to take some big chunks of the Inflation Reduction Act money, and we're going to give it to some external grant makers, and they're going to turn around and sub-grant that money out to communities that need it or their local partners, right? And that's going to mean that we're going to remove that barrier that so many communities face when they need $100,000, when they need $300,000 to get started, but they can't come to the federal government for it. The burden is too great. The capacity is too limited. They can't come do the full federal acquisition for $300,000. So these grant makers are going to be out there. They will have already gone through that process of coming to us to get the money, and they'll be able to turn around with a simplified grant application and grant out thousands of these sub-awards across the United States so that communities have the support they need, the financial support they need to really be able to start to make progress on it. We're also, if we go to the next slide, we're going to have more forms of technical assistance. So not just the Tic Tacs. The Tic Tacs are going to be doing the really basic thing. We're standing up and we're using that $200 million in the Inflation Reduction Act because the Tic Tacs are actually being paid for out of our annual appropriation. No Inflation Reduction Act money at this time is going to the Tic Tacs. It's all coming from our annual appropriation and then the funding from the Department of Energy. We have $200 million to provide more specialized forms of technical assistance. So communities that are doing the plan, they're doing the projects, or they actually have received a grant and they need help reporting, they need help tracking, they need help handling the oversight of it so that it's really stewarded effectively. We're going to have more forms of very specialized technical assistance so that as we're giving out money, whether it's the small pots of money going out through the grant makers or the really big pots of money coming out through the implementation grants, that they'll have access to expert technical assistance to really help them on their journey, help them with design their projects and help them implement their projects. If we go on to the next slide, just very quickly, this is something that we, and I mentioned earlier, this summer, hopefully by August, we'll have these environment climate justice change grants come out. Again, this will be where $2 billion goes out. We're looking, we don't even know yet exactly how big of an award we'll make per award. It'll probably be somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 to $20 million. It'll be a really flexible grant though, so that communities that come in and they want to do pollution reduction, they want to work on climate change, they want to engage their local city on how to change the code to deal with heat island stuff, and they actually want to go out and plant some trees, we'll be able to fund that sort of a project, right? And really fill that gap in funding. We don't want to fund stuff that DOE can fund. We don't want to fund stuff that our water program can fund, but there's always a gap in between when communities are ready and being able to access those other really big pots of money. That gap is what we want to fill with these change grants so that communities have everything they need to pull down the resources from the rest of the federal government to fund the projects that are actually going to make change happen on the ground in their communities. I'm not sure if I have one more slide or not. I might. But I'm also out of time. No, that was perfect. There we go. Great. So I'll hand it back over to you, Brian. Oh, you're on mute, Brian, but you're introducing Jahi.
My apologies. I was on mute. Jahi Wise, great to have you on the stage. And as a reminder to participants, please put the questions in the Q&A and leave the chat available for technical assistance. Jahi, over to you.
Hey, Brian, and hey, everyone. Jahi Wise here. It's good to be back with the Interagency Working Group on Coal and Power Plant Communities. This work group does incredible work for communities that desperately need federal support. And I was honored as part of my time in the White House to work on helping to stand this up. I currently serve as Senior Advisor to the Administrator of the EPA and the Acting Director of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I know we're short on time, so I have kind of three big picture points to hit on over the course of the presentation today. The first is about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and its scope and scale. It's a $27 billion program that was funded through the Inflation Reduction Act. It is the largest non-tax investment in the Inflation Reduction Act and is intended to be a historic down payment of catalytic capital to deliver clean technology projects to communities across the country, particularly those that have been historically left behind. Two, this fund is intended to support energy communities, among other communities that desperately need support. This fund will fund a series of national nonprofit financing institutions that will provide financial products in places that don't currently have access to capital to deploy clean energy and clean technology projects. And so this will catalyze a financing ecosystem that provides capital to the dozens of projects I was privileged to hear about as I work with energy communities across the country to focus on economic revitalization and job creation. And lastly, we put out an implementation framework for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund last week. It's a 50-page piece of guidance that articulates how we intend to deliver the resources that have been provided to EPA to implement this fund. And we are welcoming folks' comments on our implementation framework. If we can skip ahead a couple slides, skip the next one. One more, sorry. Perfect. So the EPA has, in the implementation framework, outlines 3 major competitions that will occur under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. The first is a National Clean Investment Fund competition that will fund 2 to 3 national nonprofits with the scope and scale to catalyze tens of thousands of clean technology projects. EPA will invest almost $14 billion to deliver in these national nonprofits who will deliver tens of thousands of projects across the country to accelerate our progress towards a decarbonized economy. A second, we will run a $6 billion competition to deploy funds into 2 to 7 hub nonprofits. These hub nonprofits will provide capitalization awards to community lenders, the credit unions, the community development financial institutions, the green banks, the native serving financial institutions who are the backbone of capital access in many of our communities. This fund will provide $6 billion of capital to flow through to those entities to help them to get into the business of providing green financing to the communities that they serve. And lastly, EPA will administer a program called Solar for All, which will provide over $7 billion, it will provide up to $7 billion of funding to 60 states, tribes, municipalities, and eligible nonprofits to administer Solar for All programs. We know that solar, particularly rooftop, residential and community solar, are the lowest cost source of electricity for households across this country. But many households, especially those in low-income and disadvantaged communities, don't have access to the capital necessary to purchase those projects up front and realize those benefits. The Solar for All program is intended to break that paradigm and make sure that all American families will have access to the lowest cost clean energy that's near to their homes. And we expect this program to result in millions of families lowering their electricity bills. So we'll run these 3 grant competitions. Our expectation, and I think this is in the next slide. Yes, perfect. We issued the implementation framework last week, as I said earlier in the presentation. We expect to issue the notice of funding opportunities in early summer of this year. We currently are not accepting applications under any of these competitions. The implementation framework is intended to be a resource for communities to weigh in on the design before we finalize it for purposes of running the competition. In the summer, we'll open the competition, and then early next year, we expect to be making awards. So we just wanted to come on and flag this historic opportunity for investment that will flow through mechanisms that mobilize billions of dollars of private capital to support economic revitalization, job creation, and economic opportunity in communities across this country. We welcome your feedback on the implementation framework. I think someone has already dropped a link to it in the chat, and we welcome the opportunity to come back and speak more about this program. Thank you. Back to you, Brian.
Well, Jahi, like you said, this is incredibly exciting, historic, and obviously good to have you here with the IWG. we do have some time for some questions for all of our speakers now. And just as a reminder, in the Q&A, this is a way we can grab the questions and make sure that we're getting them answered after this webinar as well. But to take some time right now in some of the highlight questions, there's one around eligibility, specifically to the bonuses for facilities that have already been closed. There's a question, and so I think this will be for Matt Axe. When the closure occurs, are they only eligible after it's closed, or if it's already been announced, and then are they eligible immediately after retirement?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Happy to speak to this. So, the law in the coal closure category, the law specifies, the coal mine or coal-fired electric generating unit having closed within, since a certain time period. And so in order to administer this credit, make sure it's clear and understandable, we worked with, for the mine piece, the Mine Safety and Health Administration, and then on the power plant side, the Energy Information Administration. And so we're going to be looking to data from those sources to tell us and to tell all of you kind of where the locations are that meet the criteria laid out in that category. I would note that if you think the data is inaccurate or missing, or the location data is irregular, there are some process spelled out in the guidance to seek a correction to that. So that's another option as well for folks if they think the data isn't fully up to date.
Great, thanks, Matt. And to add a little bit to that,
Yep.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say we can put the actual statutory language in the chat or the Q&A answers, but it is very specific that the census tracts have to have a coal mine closed after December 31st, 1999, or a coal plant closed after December 31st, 2009. So coal-fired electric generating unit has been retired, or which is directly adjoining to one of those census tracts. So it's pretty clear about what that means. But once you hit that date and there is a closure, then you qualify. So I think that's important.
Yeah, and for those communities that know, if there's an announced closure that's still in the future, things can get lined up. There is certainty that once the closure occurs, that tax credit is eligible. Another one slightly related as well, Matt, while I have you up here, when we're reviewing communities under the 0.17% that might change from year to year, does it mean that communities can be removed from the bonus tax credit? And what would be those implications?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm glad that we're circling back to this. So I think, when we wrote the guidance, we were very mindful of wanting to have stability and predictability for folks who were undertaking projects. And so our guidance includes what we're calling the beginning of construction safe harbor. So essentially, if you're in an energy community using the data and the criteria, as of the date of construction, you'll be considered being in an energy community, even if, say, the unemployment rate changes in the future. And so we really hope that kind of beginning of construction safe harbor provides clarity and certainty, so there isn't, things changing or as unemployment rates and data change.
Matt and Kate, thank you so much. I'm going to move to Matt Tejada for a moment. With regard to the TIC tax, how are we getting the information out to communities? Because it's noted that awareness is one more obstacle for communities and organizations to access the TIC tax. And then if there's not a TIC tax for a specific region, can they go to the next closest one?
Yeah, so those are both great questions. So that awareness and the marketing really of the availability of the TIC tax and something they do, we are working on that inside of the government. But I recognize that the government's not always the best at doing that sort of job. So that's why that's going to be part of the actual job of the TIC tax as well. And we'll be working with those TIC tax over the summer to make sure that we have really strong marketing, awareness, educational material, and a campaign to make sure that gets out across the United States. One of the things that really gives us an advantage is that this has been an idea that EJ communities and EJ organizations have been asking for a long time. So there's already some pretty broad awareness in the EJ movement that this is happening. As soon as we get the TIC tax stood up and we can start to activate that and tap into that awareness and that energy to really help broadcast, to all those tens of thousands of communities that really are going to need some direct outreach, some direct contacting. That's going to happen. We were also, as I mentioned, we have 3 national TIC-TACs. That's going to be part of their job too, to help us really have a consistent marketing and awareness campaign that includes all of the different TIC-TACs. We'll also be working through a lot of our regional offices where we're increasing our staff, our EJ dedicated staff at EPA pretty dramatically. We're going from about 40 staff to 400 staff right now. The majority of those new staff are going to be out in our regions, particularly for the point to support being able to engage, being able to spread resources, spread awareness to those resources. Those 3 national TIC-TACs as well. Part of the reason that we have 3 is because we do have some gaps in coverage across the United States, particularly in kind of the Rocky Mountain, Intermountain West area. We didn't have a TIC-TAC proposal that we could award in that specific geography. So for now, those national TIC-TACs, particularly ICMA and the National Indian Health Board, they're going to be helping to gap fill in those areas. We also have some partners from some of the other regionally based TIC-TACs that get into some of those areas. So we'll be able to cover those from the get-go. And we're also already investigating ways that we can maybe go out and create some greater density in places like the Rocky Mountains, the Intermountain West, and potentially also the Pacific Islands and Alaska. So we have more dedicated TIC-TACs so we can really grow this program. This was always just going to be the first wave for us. We'd always hoped that this would just be the first wave. We didn't want to pilot it. We knew we needed to go big immediately. So I'm really happy that we do have a national coverage. We just have a few gaps here and there. So we'll go back and we'll correct those over time. But we've built in those national TIC-TACs to help cover those gaps in the meantime.
Matthew, thank you so much. And there are certainly lots of questions around, so community capacity and things like that. And again, as a reminder, we will get answers to these up on the past events page. I do want to go one more question with Jahi. I want to toss to you. Do you believe that every state has the policy or regulatory framework in place to qualify for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund Solar for All opportunity? And is third-party ownership policy a framework or prerequisite or qualification for those funds?
That's a great question, and I'm going to turn it right back to the commenter. That's part of the reason we published the implementation framework last week, was to start to articulate what we think is necessary at the state level in order for all communities to have access to low-cost residential clean energy. We very much welcome folks' thoughts on whether we've gotten the fine-tuning kind of right, what elements, including third-party ownership, net metering, et cetera, are essential to deploying, so that we can integrate those into the program design as we prepare to release the final competition notices. So great question, and actually would really, really appreciate any feedback that commenter has on the design that we proposed.
Jahi, thank you so much. And thank you for everyone. I really hate to cut it off. We could spend another couple of hours on this. And thanks to the participants for such a robust Q&A. We are committed to get answers to these. The link is now in the chat, energycommunities.gov/past events, and you can find in a day or so, we'll have the slides up from every presenter today, because there's so much important information, and we will be answering your questions. So please do get involved. Just like Jahi said, we want your feedback. We want to have your feedback on our programs and what information you need. So please do get involved. We have lots of stakeholder engagement opportunities. Here's the QR code to our website, and please do continue to follow us and sign up at our website, attend our webinars, and get us questions and information. If you go to the next slide, you can find more places where you can find our information at energycommunities.gov. And we have some upcoming events that I do want to take a chance to highlight. If we can go to that upcoming event slide, there. And so just some to highlight here in just a couple of weeks, the Kentucky Highlands Rural Partners Network Community Forum. The RPN, Rural Partners Network, is out of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We're working hand in hand with investing in rural communities and energy communities. And in this May 11th event in Pineville, Kentucky, we'll have some great programming and really diving into to Eastern Kentucky. In Wyoming, I want to really highlight and give a tremendous thanks to Senator Lummis's staff for organizing a federal funding summit on June 12th to 15th at Sheridan College. It is hosted by Governor Mark Gordon and both Senators Barrasso and Lummis. And then in Illinois, the Illinois Basin regional convening. This is one of our rapid response teams, June 27th and 28th in Effington, Illinois. So all kinds of exciting events coming up. Please stay in touch, and we will be answering all of your questions, and you'll find it at energycommunities.gov/past events. Thank you for joining us today, and hope you have a great afternoon, rest of your day. And thank you all for all the work you're doing in energy communities across the country. It is important that in the energy transition, we are not leaving any community behind. And thank you for your help in doing that. Have a great day.